Thanks so much for joining us for our first session focused on renewable gas deployment in Australia. I'm delighted to introduce Jason Dickfos from EDL, who is our sponsor for this session. EDL have been fantastic supportive members of Bioenergy Australia for quite a number of years, and we are delighted to have their support for this event. Jason.
Thanks, Shahana. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here joining you all today. For this morning's session, I'm joined by two industry leaders to discuss the global deployment of renewable natural gas, or biomethane as we call it here in Australia. We've got Scott Grierson, CEO of Valorify, and Faizal Hassan from Anew Climate in the US. And Faizal will be joining from the US by Teams. This is a topic of particular interest at Australian Renewable Fuels Week, with the rapid expansion of this industry elsewhere in the world. But to date, unfortunately, we have seen only limited development domestically. Reporting shared by the Australian Energy Council as recently as last month puts waste-to-energy projects just about on par with solar and hydroelectric power as the three most supported forms of new energy generation going forward for Australia. But to date, potential far outweighs action to realise these opportunities, with biomethane as a no-regrets fuel of choice to displace fossil fuel-derived natural gas. As an introduction, I'll give a quick overview of EDL's perspective in this sector and what we're doing, particularly in the biomethane project space, and how we're investing capital. Scott is going to provide his perspectives on the world energy and biogas outlook, and Faizal is going to give us his take on the US biomethane industry and its future outlook. We'll then move to a Q&A process like we did this morning. So on EDL. EDL was established and remains headquartered in Brisbane and has been supplying energy solutions and supporting our customers on their decarbonisation journey for close to 35 years. We have grown our diversified energy portfolio from thermal power stations for remote mines and towns to hybrid renewable microgrids incorporating wind and solar, as well as converting waste gas from underground coal mines and landfills into electricity, and most recently taking waste gases like landfill and converting it into biomethane. We own and operate 88 power stations and gas processing plants across 5 countries, 3 continents, with the capacity to sell over 1 gigawatt of power into 16 markets. Through our global operations, we're enabling customers to avoid close to 3.4 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent each year. So our energy transition. We began in 1988 with a power station at Pine Creek in the Northern Territory. The power station still operates today, providing valuable network support to the Darwin-Catherine network. From there, we have diversified with our first power station fuelled by biogas from landfill in Victoria in 1995, our Clayton landfill. Our first waste coal mine gas project we commenced in 1996 with South 32's Appin mine in New South Wales. We opened our first liquefied natural gas plant at Maitland in Karratha in Western Australia in 2008. From there, we then started to focus on sustainable remote energy solutions with projects like the Anew Remote Renewable Hybrid project. We were supplying power to that remote gold mine for goldfields, and where 50% of that power is coming from renewable sources. In 2020, we focused our efforts primarily in North America, transitioning existing landfill gas to electricity projects to biomethane to pipeline projects. Our goal is to continuously improve the sustainability of our projects. For remote energy, that means striving to increase our renewable energy percentage for each of the projects. And for clean energy, it's by creating more value from the waste streams that we use and create value for, striving to contribute more to the circular economy. So we move now to North America. The growth of the biomethane or renewable natural gas industry in the US is a great example of the success that can be achieved when the right regulatory framework is put in place. Without taking too much away from Faizal, what Faizal will present shortly, the demand for biomethane in the US is significant, and the investment fundamentals are very different to here in Australia. Over the last 4 years, we have invested more than $500 million in the US biomethane sector. There are multiple markets for the product, and the sector is booming. Today in the US, there are just over 330 biomethane plants in operation, another 165 in construction, and another 320 plus projects in development. One of the larger markets for RNG, or biomethane, in the US is for transportation fuel, which has grown 17% in usage since 2021 and increased 218% over the last 5 years. And this stat, I think, speaks volumes to how impressive their market is. In 2022, 69% of all the gas used in the transport sector in the US came from renewable natural gas, offsetting 5.6 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, or more than 2.4 billion litres of diesel. It's an amazing achievement, largely due to having the right regulatory framework in place that stimulates investment. The regulatory framework sets long-term targets and provides flexible mechanisms so markets can grow with confidence without jeopardising supply or demand. These features have been critical to the rapid, but importantly sustainable growth the US has seen in this space. We started commissioning our 2 newest facilities, Limestone and Lorraine, both in Ohio, in the second half of last year. And when they ramp up to full operating capacity this year, EDL will have a combined annual production capacity in the US of just over 7 petajoules, or equivalent to about 20 TJs a day. Developing biomethane projects is a complex undertaking, but we firmly believe the returns are worthwhile, and we are actively pursuing more opportunities in the US and Canada, and we're looking at active projects and opportunities in the UK and eventually here in Australia. But to do so requires the right conditions for investment, particularly here, including, importantly, a supportive regulatory framework. Before I hand over to Chris, I'd like to play just a short video about the biomethane process that neatly encapsulates much of what we are discussing here today.
As a leading global producer of sustainable distributed energy, EDL is dedicated to a world of new energy for our customers, stakeholders, and communities. We've invested in technology that processes landfill gas to renewable natural gas, otherwise known as RNG or biomethane. From heating homes to powering nationwide fleets and aircraft, RNG is a clean, affordable, and reliable waste-derived fuel that is available and being used across the world right now. Our RNG projects create an alternate source to fossil fuel by capturing methane, a naturally occurring but potent greenhouse gas produced by the decomposition of garbage in landfills, and redirect it away from the environment, repurposing it as a clean, green energy source. RNG provides environmental benefits by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, enhancing air quality, and promoting a circular economy through the beneficial use of waste gas. RNG is not just helping to slow the effects of climate change now, it's also helping local economies become more sustainable for the future. The best part is, RNG is a low-carbon equivalent replacement for natural gas in existing infrastructure and projects. Producing RNG demonstrates EDL's pivotal role in steering the global shift from conventional energy to decarbonized solutions, embodying our commitment to delivering sustainable benefits for communities, stakeholders, and the environment.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Scott, not Chris. Sorry for Chris. Yes, good morning everyone. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. For what it's worth, my 6-year-old came back from primary school last week after learning about the local Indigenous culture. I live on the Mornington Peninsula, and he described himself as a proud Boonwurrung man, so I think that's progress. So I get to do the 30,000 feet view, and I guess a bit like a jet plane, I might move fairly quickly. Before I get into it though, I suppose what I would say is that I'm really pleased to see so many ex-colleagues, suppliers, partners, friends, etc. in the room. But I put the challenge out to the sector that this is a fabulous exchange, and I really pay my respects to the guys at Bioenergy Australia in putting together a fabulous conference and for all of the other hard work they do for the sector. But we need to get out there and evangelise this, and hopefully, telling this story in a broader sense and giving you a taste. And look, I'm probably not going to teach a lot of people in the room things that they don't already know today, but I think it's time for us to really get out and embrace the multi-sectoral challenge that sort of biomass and bioenergy generally represents. Because often when I talk to different ministerial departments at state and federal level, they'll often go, "Oh, you don't want to speak to me, go and speak to the other guys." There isn't that cross-fertilisation occurring yet, and there's generally low levels of literacy. So I think it's great for us to have these exchanges, but we've got to get out there. Anyway, I'll move right along. Assuming it plays ball. Okay, it was my mistake. So firstly, I'd like to say, talking in the world of biogas, depending on where you are in the world, it's a bit of a melange of different terminology for those who are uninitiated or unaware. There's so many different ways to refer to gas supply, and it's measured in time, in volume, in flow, in all sorts of different things in different parts of the world. So as I go through this, you'll see lots of different units. But don't be too scared. But typically, obviously, in Australia, we talk about petajoules, gigajoules, megajoules, etc. That's the way we trade here. But you add to this, of course, a variety of currencies, which are not particularly challenging or difficult to get over. But what's inconsistent in what's often reported in global reports around biogas and biomethane is that sometimes people are using the direct biogas without separation and upgrading, and sometimes we're talking about the separated biomethane product, and hence that's why now you see emerging this sort of biomethane equivalent type metric, which I think is very important, because usage is sometimes a bit of a mixture of those. But the overall trend I'm seeing in the market globally is for upgrading to accelerate, and for an increasing fraction of biogas to be upgraded and separated to a biomethane product. And industrialisation of biogas is starting to accelerate, right? The early years of this technology back in the European Union, for instance, and other parts of the world were predicated largely on sort of farm scale type units, domestic scale kind of technologies. We're now moving to this larger utility sort of centralised kind of model, which I think is good. Is Bernadette McCabe in the room? I don't think she's here, actually. I haven't seen her in the conference. I did want to pay my respects and acknowledge the work that she's done in representing Australia on the IEA Bioenergy Task 37 mission. And a lot of what I'm pulling from here in this presentation, or some of it, is actually drawing directly on the work of her and her colleagues internationally that have actually published that report. But let's do the flyover. In the European Union, European biogas supply in more recent times and forecasts out to 2050 is pretty impressive, and there's a variety of sources and background information and data that we can draw on to actually illustrate this. But we're seeing in nations such as Denmark, and I've got a particularly soft spot for that part of the world, having lived there for quite a while, but certainly they're rapidly moving towards, depending on who you speak to in the Danish government and society, but somewhere between 2030 and 32 they'll be fully independent for gas delivery in that nation using biomethane, separated biomethane. So there's a pretty hockey stick type trend that's occurring across the European Union and accelerating investments in the growth of biogas and separation to biomethane. It certainly does help to have the Russians holding a gun to your head, so to speak. That is a bit of a motivator in that part of the world, because so much of their energy supply does come from that part of the world.
but it certainly helped to really accelerate an interest and investment in this sector. They're targeting 35 billion cubic metres in the European Union by 2030. That's the target of the European Union Commission, which is a pretty impressive quantum. And one of the things I wanted to really emphasise here too is the economy-wide benefits, because we don't often talk about this. The multiplying effect of bioenergy and biogas plants is quite transformational, particularly in regional areas, but more generally. And it is a part of leveraging that cross-sectoral opportunity that I discussed before. But in the EU and the UK, this is forecast to range between 35 and 73 billion euros per annum of net economic benefit, which I think again tells part of that story that we're trying to get across. I would make the point that crop stubble is also, crop stubble burn-off, I beg your pardon, is banned in a lot of EU member countries, and that has also driven a lot of the innovation in this sector. But you can see there that graphic from the European Bioenergy Biogas Association. There's a significant volume of jobs being created, installations and share of the overall energy pie being contributed to through this pathway. So I think that's, that sort of sells itself, that graphic, without me needing to walk through it. What's really interesting, I think, in the European Union is that it's horses for courses. It's not a standardised approach. In different countries, it's used and prioritised in different ways based on different policy levers and incentives. So you can see here, depending on where your flavour is or where your European focus is, that there's a mixture of different uses, you know, for electricity production, for industrial heat, and feedstocks for heating and cooling, and for transport. So, you know, we tend to think of Europe as being this kind of vanilla kind of environment where they sort of make these decisions in Brussels and everybody does the same thing. That's not the case in this particular instance anyway, and there's a broad range of different end uses and applications that biomethane or RNG is put to. So I think that's really interesting. And that's reflected here also in the different kind of tariffs and incentive structures that are adopted in different European nation countries. So you can see that there's a mixture of fixed feed-in tariffs that apply in certain countries. There's a feed-in premium, which is where you're sort of pegging to the market and actually paying a premium on top of a floating price, essentially. Obviously, given that gas markets can be quite volatile. There are targets and quota systems in certain countries, incentives and various other forms of investment support. So there is no one-size-fits-all, and I think that's something for us to actually consider in the Australian context. Here we go again. Right, I'm not going to say too much about this, and I suspect that Jason and I pulled some stats from exactly the same report, but I'll leave it largely to Faizal to really kind of fill in some of the holes here. But renewable natural gas, suffice to say, is a growing, rapidly growing and significantly well-established sector in the United States and increasingly in Canada. Probably there are other drivers there, just like in the European Union, that have helped to push this along. And to Jason's point, there are an ecosystem of incentives and structures there that actually drive investment and encourage bringing forth increasing supply in that context. Of course, it's very well known that in California, for instance, that there's a significant use of biogas as it's converted and then used in vehicle fleets, and that's a really encouraging opportunity for the transport sector. But generally speaking, I won't say any more on that because you'll hear a lot more about that in the next presentation. What have I done here? Okay, so I think China's the real big sort of 800-pound gorilla in this room that we don't often talk about, as it so often is in many instances and sectors. But in China, there's an estimated more than 100,000 established commercial biogas plants. And that number is not a typo that you see for household domestic biogas units. More than 39 million estimated small-scale domestic household biogas units. It's quite staggering. It's something we don't hear a lot about in conversation around biogas as well, and I think it's something that we need to pay a bit more attention to. Part of the equation for them in China, and having lived and worked there as well, it's interesting that the acceptability of biological fertilisers and recycling of nutrients is part of an accepted practice that goes back for thousands of years. And so the idea of taking digestate or biofertiliser derived from a biogas plant and reapplying it, or beneficiating it and reapplying it back into an agricultural context is generally very well accepted. Here people look at you like you're slightly a bit crazy and not quite sure how it's going to turn out. Over there, it's the mainstay of kind of source of nutrients for a lot of their agricultural production. So that existing biogas kind of footprint that they have in the PRC is equivalent to almost 10 million tonnes of inorganic fertiliser equivalent consumption on an annualised basis. It's just staggering numbers, like everything in China. But what I really wanted to point to here, notwithstanding differences in our political systems, is that they are, you know, there's an old gag about the French ambassador and the Chinese ambassador sitting down and having lunch. And at the end of the lunch, the Frenchman sits back and he says, "So what did you think of the French Revolution?" And the Chinese ambassador sits back and says, "Well, it's too early to tell." And I think the gag there, or the story behind that, is that they come off a very long run-up, right? They plan in very long timeframes, and they have recently published their 13th five-year plan for biomass and biogas. What would we love to have to celebrate a 13th plan in Australia for biomass and biogas? They have supporting policies and an ecosystem and framework here for guidelines and promoting gas industrialisation across the country, strategic plans in actually recognising that cross-sectoral linkage for regional development and what that means in transforming and jobs and, you know, nutrient recovery and waste utilisation, etc. And of course laws that back this up as well. So, you know, I think it's a really important lesson that we cannot progress a scaled biogas, biomethane sector in Australia without that ecosystem of support, and these guys are probably doing it better than anyone, which is why you see those staggering numbers up there. So this really tells the story. In Australia, you know, we have some progress. I don't mean to sort of completely dish what we've got here, and there's a lot of people in this room and others before us that have really worked hard to try and get this sector moving, but we're sort of well behind the eight ball. And at the end of the day, you can see Germany is often touted in biogas circles as an exemplar, but again, you look at the sheer sort of volume of installations again in the PRC, and it really starts to tell the story. Oops. Likewise, if we translate that into production volumes, again, you can see in China, in terawatt hours per year, sorry about the unit, but you're talking, you know, 70,000 terawatt hours per year, compared to in Australia, just over 1.5. So you do the maths on that, of what percentage we are of the PRC, notwithstanding a much smaller population, of course, but certainly they are streets ahead of the rest of the world in terms of production volume. Finally, on the IEA, and sort of summarising, it's important to recognise that biogas is a mature technology. In Australia, there's a perception that it's both small scale and maybe not that mature. Clearly, it's mature, and certainly there's been others today already point to that. I've already talked about the fact that utilisation can be a mixture or an upgraded kind of product, the RNG that's separated from that. Under the IEA net zero emissions scenario in 2050, biogases recently were recognised as an important contributor to that overall target, but we need to quadruple that production, right, by 2030. So there's a target for us. But significant kind of compounding annual growth rates and an opportunity to really participate in that global movement here in Australia. I would add, because I'm slightly partisan in this regard, that by 40% of the global forecast production volume out to 2040 by the IEA is expected to come from agricultural residues. So there's a huge opportunity, and certainly in the CSIRO presentation this morning there was no mention of biomethane and anaerobic digestion as a pathway to actually achieving that. So I would argue that ag residues will play a huge role in biomethane and anaerobic digestion moving forward. A couple of thoughts really reflecting on what's important and what we've seen in other parts of the world is that co-products are really, really important, okay? And digestate is a really big part of that story. It's key to that circular economy story. It's a great fertiliser, as I've already talked about. It closes that loop and provides that fabulous kind of nutrient cycling capability. And increasingly, I think, and in Australia, it will be important to social licence. Certainly in the agricultural sector at least, I see a lot of conversations with farmers. They're concerned about nutrients and management of nutrients, and that's part of what they do on a daily basis. So helping them to understand that virtuous cycle is really, really important. Digestate as an end product has proven to be a lot safer to use, and there are good examples of this than taking raw organic material and spreading it on the land. So there's definitely a pathway to beneficiation even through that AD process that I think is important. But some interesting stats from the European Biogas Association, again, that 1 tonne of artificial fertiliser that's replaced with a digestate-derived equivalent, okay, saves that 1 tonne of oil, 108 tonnes of water and 7 tonnes of CO2 emissions. So some really, again, great multiplying benefits that you get through the realisation of that opportunity. What I would say is that digestate too, in the Australian context, I think in the absence at the moment of any significant subsidies or additional supports, is really, really critical to supporting the financial performance of a plant. Interestingly, there's this crazy idea emerging of renewable CO2 through this pathway, right? Whoever thought that was a thing until quite recently? But biogas plants are potentially some of the largest concentrated sources of this biogenic CO2. So there's an opportunity there, which I think, again, will be critical to supporting commercial viability. I didn't know that vegan, kosher or halal CO2 was a thing. But believe me, there is a market out there and there's a premium for it, and being biogenic as well potentially ticks the boxes for a lot of food manufacturers out there, particularly with an export orientation. That's really interesting. Of course, biogenic CO2 is important as a feedstock for P2X plants, and that can deliver net negative greenhouse gas reductions on an overall life cycle basis when you're actually separating the biomethane and then also leveraging that CO2 with renewable hydrogen. Finally, there's some interesting work being done to look at mixed biogas and shifting away from that to liquids and other such products to actually avoid the separation and upgrading pathway. And then biomethanation is a really interesting opportunity too, to increase the shift, change the ratio and the shift of biomethane in a biogas mixture. Right. This slide really just tells itself by looking at that picture. This is the number of P2X plants that are either announced or under development or going through financing phases in the European Union. So just gives you a sense of the opportunity for P2X and e-fuel synthesis, which really is only starting to kind of enter the dialogue here in Australia. It's well and truly established in other parts of the world, and it's a big opportunity to leverage on the back of biogas plants. Conscious of time, so I need to finish here. Thank you, Georgie. What does this all mean for Australia? A couple of quick points. Obviously, biogas is an important contributor to the diversity and the resilience of our clean energy future. The tech's mature, but what we need to do, just as we saw in that slide with the European Union, is work out where it's going to be best deployed in the sector and what policies and frameworks will actually support that effectively. We're going to need subsidies and incentives just like all other parts of the energy ecosystem. And that's important. Certification is going to be really, really critical, and of course supporting the work of Bioenergy Australia in moving forward that dialogue around the guarantee of origin. And thanks, Brad and the team at Green Power, for actually giving us a pathway in the interim. Upgrading is going to be increasingly important, and getting product to market, I think, particularly using the existing infrastructure that we have. And we've heard today already about the mega tonnages of additional feedstock we could grow through various different types of non-food crops on non-arable land. So increasing and centralising processing helps us to reduce cost as well. So I think we'll see an increase in centralised, larger scale plants. And of course, there's that momentum building in P2X plants, which I think will be really important for us to focus on moving forward. I took this photograph on Monday afternoon, flying in from Melbourne to Canberra. It's a bit grainy, it's not a great photo, it never quite turns out that well when you're photographing out a plane window, but you can see in the horizon, across the horizon, crop stubble burn off occurring almost as far as the eye could see out towards Albury, okay, and Wodonga. So the point being that there's a huge missed opportunity in ag residues that are just simply going up in smoke that could be converted to energy products. The first rule is to use the infrastructure we have. I think that's an important kind of distinguishing factor for all of these nations and areas of the world that actually have embraced biomethane. Energy security independence is a big issue, and we've heard from the military yesterday in particular around how that can be supported through these measures. Stakeholder engagement is definitely important, but it's naturally linked to country, and I think there's good opportunities to engage with Indigenous participation in these projects as well. Finally, my last thought is waste is always going to be with us. It's our duty to do something more productive with it, and simply torching it in the paddock and setting it up into smoke is a travesty in an era of climate change. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Hello. Quick introduction. I'm Faizal Hassan. I am one of the VPs on the R&G desk for Anew Climate. I've been with the Anew Climate for about 8 years now, and primarily what I do is interface a lot with our producers. Anew, fundamentally, we don't own, operate, build, finance, produce R&G. We're in the business of marketing the R&G produced from those projects. And so I'm gonna switch here to my slides. Hopefully that works well enough, but bear with me if it does not. Okay. Perfect. Got it on the first try. So today, I think Scott and just wanted to first off thank Bioenergy Australia for putting this on, inviting us to speak on this panel. EDL as well. I know we've been able to establish a relationship and better understand some of the opportunities here in the States that we've got with RNG. But fundamentally, I'd like to focus really on what we're seeing here in North America, US and Canada specifically. And so Anew, again, like I said earlier, we don't own, operate, or produce pipeline spec RNG. We're in the business of marketing the RNG that's produced from these projects. We really work well with producers who are building 2, 3, 4, 5 projects a year and want to better understand what the value of that RNG is in different markets. And so I know the RFS and the LCFS are the primarily the big markets here in the United States that are driving the vast majority of RNG growth here in the States. But there are other markets out there that I think is really worth discussing. And so today we have about 55 facilities that we're managing the offtake for across across North America, the majority of them here in the States. But the beauty about the projects here in the States is that we focus really primarily on 3 different types of feedstocks: landfill gas, wastewater treatment gas, or fats, oils, greases, other organic waste, as well as agricultural gas. And so we've got a number of large dairies, a number of large swine facilities that produce a large amounts of waste, and the standard operating procedure when it comes to those facilities is to put them in a digester of some sort. And so really though, if you look at the RFS and the LCFS market, these are transportation fuel markets. And so you've got to jump through a couple of hoops to actually realize the value of this gas. And so today, when you put the gas in the pipeline, you're actually putting a physical commodity on the pipeline. And so you've got to understand the physical molecules, the nomination, scheduling, and the actual transport of the physical molecules. You've got to convert that RNG that's being produced into a transportation fuel. And at the end of the day, you've got to go through a number of regulatory and reporting requirements and actually be able to generate those credits. And then once those credits are generated, we actually market those on behalf of our clients to those end users or those obligated parties. And so this, I think, is really a good summary of what are the RNG value drivers that we're seeing here in the States. And so today, again, the vast majority of the RNG that's being produced in the States is going into the compliance market. It is going into the vehicle fuel markets. But what's interesting enough is that there is what was recently passed just last year was the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, provides the growth on the front end of these projects by providing what we call an investment tax credit, which potentially provides up to 40% of the capex associated with the project. You get that value back directly from the Treasury, directly from the IRS here in the form of tax credits. And so going out and spending $10-15 million on an RNG project, knowing that at the end of the year you'll be able to recoup up to 40% of that project capex in the form of tax credits, and be able to actually sell those tax credits. It provides a lot of value. And so fundamentally, though, you've got three drivers on across the RNG market here in the States: the Inflation Reduction Act, which is what I call the incentivized tax reduction market. You've got the compliance markets, which again are largely driven by the vehicle fuel markets. But you've also got the ability to export that or the renewable fuel into Europe, for example. And so one of the compliance markets that we're relatively active in is the RED program, as well as the ISCC EU program. And so if you look at the fuel makeup in the fuel consumption there in Europe, a lot of that methanol, for example, is being produced here in the United States and being, put on a barge, put on an ocean-going vessel, and sent into Europe. And so being able to feed the RNG to the biomethanol facility, so that they can utilize those actual RNG molecules in the production of the biomethanol, and then putting that biomethanol on an ocean-going vessel and sending it to Europe, I think just goes to show you how universal or how global this market is. And then specifically, we are starting to see a lot of sustainability initiatives. And so yes, we've got this tax incentivized market where you can recoup a tremendous amount of your capex via tax credits. Yes, you've got the ability to produce RNG, put it in the pipe, generate credits, and market those credits to obligated parties and realize a healthy amount of value. But you've also got a number of sustainability initiatives that I think are also just as important in pushing along the value of RNG in the market, because there are a number of Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, along with natural gas utilities, along with universities, that understand that their scope 1 emissions are largely driven by the natural gas that they consume on site. And so being able to replace that natural gas with RNG allows those companies, those organizations who are looking to become carbon neutral or carbon zero, the ability to offset those emissions. And so again, being able to replace the physical natural gas molecules with renewable natural gas for our voluntary consumers, that provides a lot of value, and a lot of our sustainability customers are willing to pay a premium for that RNG just so that they can make those claims themselves. And so another thing that I think is also worth mentioning is that RNG is a very unique product, in the sense that I know a lot of, here, I'm based in San Diego, California, and one of the things that we're seeing here in San Diego is the drive or the initiative to electrify everything, right? And so today, yes, it does make a tremendous amount of sense to electrify light-duty passenger vehicles. You've seen the success that Tesla and some of those other electric vehicle manufacturers have been able to get to. But there are some challenges fundamentally with utilizing electricity, hydrogen, and some of those other next generation fuels when you compare it with RNG. RNG fundamentally is 99.9% methane. It's no different than natural gas from that perspective. And so you can utilize the existing infrastructure when it comes to realizing the ability, or you can utilize the fundamental pipeline network here in the United States to be able to deliver RNG from, say, a facility here in California to an end user, say, in Texas or Louisiana or Ohio. And so fundamentally being able to take advantage of the existing infrastructure, and by the way, the ability to utilize RNG in a number of different factors, in a number of different ways, I think is important to point out as well, right? You can take it, compress it, liquefy it, utilize it the same way that you use traditional fossil gas today, but you can also capture it, clean it up, put it in a pipe, utilize it for thermal energy, utilize it in a heater, utilize it in a boiler, potentially to produce steam. And that provides, again, real world reductions of natural gas consumption. But if you take a look at some of the next generation fuels, you've got the ability to take RNG, feed it into a steam methane reformer, and produce hydrogen, right? And that hydrogen you can utilize to produce, fuel cells. You can also utilize that to produce some of the feedstocks required in the production of renewable diesel. You can utilize it to help bring down the carbon intensity of the end fuel that you're producing. And so that I think is also another thing to keep in mind. I think when you look at here, the Inflation Reduction Act, you've got the ability to take RNG, put it on the pipe, send it to a traditional refinery so that they can use it to produce clean hydrogen. You can take it, send it to a facility that produces ammonia for fertilizer purposes, and then you can utilize it as a feedstock or as a fuel gas in the production of sustainable aviation fuel, ethanol, renewable diesel as well. And so one thing that we're starting to see here in the United States is the transition from a one-to-one RNG equivalent to a focus more on carbon intensity specifically. And so carbon intensity, grams of CO2 equivalent emitted per megajoule of energy produced. And so understanding how the baseline emission profiles, understanding how much energy is utilized at the facility itself to produce those fuels. A lot of these programs that we're seeing here in the States, they are technology agnostic. They are end fuel agnostic in the sense that they don't primarily want to dictate you in utilizing a specific type of fuel. They want to kind of level the playing field in terms of understanding what the carbon intensity is across different fuels. And so that's what the carbon intensity factor really provides, is the ability to fundamentally understand, when you compare different classes of fuels, what their carbon footprint is. And so again, understanding how you can utilize RNG with the existing infrastructure, understanding how you can take RNG, utilize it to produce an actual end fuel like CNG and LNG, taking RNG and utilizing it to produce a biointermediate, which is a fuel that a product that ends up being converted into the end fuel, and then as well as fundamentally being able to combust it in a turbine, in a genset, to produce electricity. That's also really interesting as well. And so I think when you take a step back and you look at the outlook for RNG, focusing in on, there are a number of different end uses for that take in the value of those avoided methane emissions. It's deep. It's really valuable. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to touch on here is what we're seeing with the natural gas utilities. And so here in the States, again, we've got a number of natural gas utilities that provide natural gas to industrial, residential, and manufacturing industries, as well as the chemical production facility refiners. And so putting the emphasis on the utilities themselves seems to be something that is gaining a lot more traction. So SB 1440, for example, is a Senate bill that was recently passed here in California that mandates the natural gas utilities in the state of California to procure up to 20% of their annual natural gas throughput as RNG by 2030. And so if you look at the overall natural gas consumption in the state of California, it's a couple BCF a day. And so reaching those levels is really going to require a lot more RNG projects to come to market. And one of the unique ways, I think, is that they're forcing that transition is with another Senate bill. So Senate Bill 1383 is an example of initiative here that was taken up in California that basically said, hey, if you're a large producer of organic waste, or if you're a municipality, for example, that has the responsibility to pick up trash from all the neighborhoods in the specific city or specific suburb, you as that municipality must procure some portion of the energy that you use as a municipality, specifically from RNG that was produced from diverted organics. And so being able to create a market, creating an end use market through 1440, which requires the utilities to procure RNG, at the same time pairing it with an initiative that requires large producers of organic waste to push that organic waste towards those biodigesters. That's kind of how you marry the two. That's how you kind of force more organics into the production of RNG, and that's how you force the development of the end use market of those RNG molecules themselves. And so I one of the, I think the key things that we are always seeing in the RNG markets here in the States is, how do I actually get these projects online, right? What are the hoops I have to jump through to actually get these facilities generating value? And I think at the end of the day, the viability of actually building a greenfield RNG project depends on the value of that RNG in those three markets: the tax incentivized market, the compliance market, and the sustainability markets. The value of that RNG itself, though, is really dependent on a number of factors, right? And so where the project is located is a large one. Again, there are some state-specific requirements that I touched on the earlier slide that require certain utilities to procure a certain amount of RNG by a certain date, and only projects in that specific state are eligible to deliver RNG into those markets. And so understanding what those state-specific requirements are for your specific RNG project, I think is important. Pipeline requirements. The pipeline network here in the States is very, there are a number of companies that have a number of different standards, and not all of them are excited about RNG. And so understanding, how far it is to get the RNG you produce into that pipeline, understanding how what gas quality standards you've got to meet to be able to inject in that pipeline is important. O2 standards, N2 standards are pretty top of the list for a lot of the RNG producers today here. And so again, understanding what it takes to get into that pipe, what it's going to cost you, and then working with that specific pipeline to understand, where they are and what those opportunities are in terms of injecting into their specific pipeline. And so, not RNG, and then moving on to the next point, not all RNG is valued the same. And so, understanding how the different feedstock types, landfill gas, agricultural gas, wastewater treatment, sludge, and various organics, the value of that RNG in those different markets, I think, again, is fundamental in determining whether you've got a viable RNG project or not. And then offtake structures, right? And so we've had the ability to enter into agreement with a number of different RNG producers, and there's a certain sensitivity on what that offtake structure is, and a lot of that sensitivity is driven by what are the requirements around actually getting that project financed, right? And so we've got a number of projects and producers who I call our wildcat producers. They're building these projects 100% on balance sheet, 100% on equity, and they're taking that risk, going into the market without a specific offtake agreement guaranteeing them some type of return per MMBTU produced. And so again, understanding what type of offtake structures are out there, what type of financeable offtake is required to actually get the funds released to actually build the project, that might require you to get creative and put together kind of a number of different structures, a hybrid of structures to get those funds unlocked. Another interesting thing to point out is cash flow, right? And so a lot of these projects that are looking at generating value from these compliance credits, those credits may only be generated quarterly. Those credits may only be generated annually. And so understanding how that might impact your bottom line, I think is important, because you might have to again get creative in how you're bridging the cash flow requirements if you're only generating credits quarterly or annually. And then change in law. And so, I can confidently say that we as our country are interesting when it comes to presidential elections, right? And we are, smack dab in gearing up for another one here in November. But understanding that there's some regulatory risk associated with a lot of these projects, and I call that stroke of the pen risk. But there could be situations where one administration starts an ambitious RNG initiative, and then the next president doesn't feel that same way, and does things that may not outright come out and cancel the program, but it could fundamentally challenge the confidence in that program. And so I've got a slide here next that talks to some of the value, some of the things that politicians are able to do behind the scenes that stay in line with the regulation, with the legislation as well, but can negatively impact pricing as well. And so understanding, again, the sensitivities around change in law, and understanding how that change in law really differs from administration to administration. Now, on a state specific side, that isn't as much of an issue. I think here the states are relatively well entrenched when it comes to getting these programs up and running. But at the federal level, there is always that risk. And then carbon intensity scores. And so I touched on that a little bit earlier, but fundamentally understanding how you can compare the value of RNG from different types of feedstocks depends primarily on what the carbon intensity is for those specific streams of RNG. And so there are a number of different ways you can calculate that carbon intensity score. You've got a couple models here that I've listed out. The greenhouse regulatory emission, that's the GREET standard. That's kind of the standard here that's used here in California for the LCFS model. You've got the ISCC model that calculates carbon intensity a little bit differently, and that's used to determine the value of that RNG in the European markets. GH Genius and Fuel LCA, those are two other additional carbon intensity methodologies that are used to determine the carbon intensity score of RNG that's heading into Canada. And so understanding the arbitrage around carbon intensity scoring, understanding what the value of that CI score is in one market and against another market, that really will drive you towards understanding what market is the best end use for you. For your specific project. But there's also some markets out there that don't really care about carbon intensity score. And so, being able to market what we call low CI projects, which is a good thing, to those markets that value carbon intensity score, as well as understanding the value of delivering RNG that doesn't have a very good carbon intensity score into markets that don't really value carbon intensity. And so that kind of all, again, really fundamentally determines where you're going to be taking the gas and what type of value you should be realizing for that gas. And then delivery type. And so right now you put the gas in a pipe in California, you've got the ability to physically transport that gas, just given the fact of how interconnected our natural gas system here is. You've got the ability to put gas in the pipe in California and deliver it to New York and actually trace the molecules from source to sink. But that might not be required, right? You've got the ability to deliver what we call by displacement or via mass balance. And all that means is if you can put it in the pipe and get a third-party pipeline statement from the natural gas utility. I wanted to focus on this slide just to give you a little bit of color on where we've seen RFS and LCFS prices historically over the last 10, 12 years. You can see in the beginning of the 2010s, it was languishing around $15 to $40 an MMBTU. But you can see here in the second half of 23, early half of or the first quarter of 2024, we are again kind of in between that $40 to $80 price point for a number of different streams. But Couple of things I wanted to point out here. A fairly large spike in natural gas prices in January 21. That was associated with the freeze that hit the states. And so one thing that's typically overlooked, I think, in the RNG world is the actual value of the commodity itself. And so understanding that physical commodity value and how that translates into these markets, I think is also important. So I will stop there. And again, just kind of highlights the ability to deliver into different markets, and that's all I got.
Thanks, Faizal. Thanks, Scott. Maybe I'll start with a macro question, then we can hand over to the audience. So we've heard about, obviously, the RNG opportunities globally. Maybe for both of you, question for both of you, how do you see the status of RNG short-term and long-term and its contribution to the energy transition and net zero? Is RNG a transition fuel, or is it something, you know, a lot more important than that?
Do you want to have first crack, Faizal? I've got the conch. I think, personally, I think for the reason, that last point that I left people with around waste always being with us, I think it's always going to have a role, right? I don't see it necessarily as a transition fuel per se. I think it has a very long future because we're always going to produce waste. In fact, it's only going to increase in volume, and we have to do something with it. And I think the key lesson in the energy transition, if you look at the way it's been managed in many other parts of the world, it's a bit, we suffer from the same problem here in Australia, Faizal, in terms of this obsession with electrification. I think there's a real message here around energy resilience and matching source to end use and applications in different sectors. And I'm really encouraged by the federal government's approach to take that sectoral approach to energy planning, because I think what that'll highlight is that there will be a continuing role.
Yeah, I totally echo Scott's statement there. We will always be producing waste, and again, the ability to take RNG, send it to a turbine to produce electricity, utilize it as a fundamental fuel, utilize it to produce hydrogen, utilize it to produce any of the gas to liquids technology that we've seen continue to grow is important. And so there will always be, I think, some fundamental value for RNG. And then when you layer in the ability to utilize the existing infrastructure, I think that, again, provides a lot more value. You know?
Has anybody in the gas sector, I was thinking and reflecting on this yesterday, ever done a study that says how much the Australian taxpayer has effectively invested or subsidised the existing gas network infrastructure in this country? Because it would be staggering. It would be a huge volume. To turn your back on that is an absolute travesty.
Yeah, to echo that as well, I think the vast majority of the expenses that we have as a household when it comes to utilizing natural gas is actually the distribution and the network charges, not the actual physical fundamental fuel itself. It's the actual cost in terms of keeping up the infrastructure to be able to deliver that natural gas.